Okay, here we go. So let me start off with an observation that I've made. You can tell me straight away if you think that it's right or wrong. But that is that almost everybody I've ever heard talk about morality seems to start from a basic assumption, whether they regard morality as objective or subjective, is that it would at least be better if it was objective. An objective set of moral facts would definitely be better than it just being our subjective positions and personal beliefs. Of course, you can understand that from the perspective of the person who does believe that morality is objective, not least because it just always seems to happen that the moral facts that they quote about the universe always seems to fit in with their personal moral tastes. I've yet to find a single individual who quotes a series of moral facts about the universe, all of which they find personally distasteful. It's odd that, isn't it? What a coincidence that happens to be. But what I find curious is that when you then move on to talk about people who regard morals as subjective, as our personal beliefs, as the positions that we have on moral issues, nevertheless, most of them admit that, well, I don't believe morality is objective. I wish it was. It would be better if it was, but it's just a fact that it isn't. I want to challenge that perspective. I think that it's fundamentally wrong. I think actually objective moral positions are actually way more horrific, potentially, than they are portrayed as being, and there's nothing to fear from subjectivity, whether that being in morality or anything else. So that's what I want to talk about in this video. And I want to throw back at Christians who assert that without objective morality, how can we say that the Nazis were morally wrong? I want to throw that back and ask how a Christian can assert, given God, given their God, that the Nazis are objectively morally wrong rather than objectively morally right. Okay, so to kick off with this, let me read out for you a comment response I got from SJ Thomason to a recent video I had made about her. As for objective moral duties, numerous global studies have surveyed thousands all over the planet that have shown we know we should follow the golden rule. Many don't, but the point is you and I agree that we have a conscience. This moral duty transcends generations, etc., so it cannot be grounded in anything physical that doesn't transcend generations. It's grounded in a metaphysical source. How do we know it's not subjective? Just as we know that what the Nazis did was objectively wrong. It's not a source of opinion, but a common ground upon which we can objectively agree. Okay, the first thing that I will have to say to that is that objective means independent of mind. Making the assertion, even if it's true, that, well, all minds agree upon this thing, in no way demonstrates that it's independent of mind, okay? It still could be independent of mind, but in no way is that a method by which you can demonstrate it. I should also point out that it's actually not true that all people think that what the Nazis did was morally wrong. I can think of at least one group who would disagree with that. I'm not going to name them. All I'm going to say is their name begins with N and ends with artses. But the Nazis are a long-standing go-to, I think, for Christian apologists looking to, well, in my view, shame or box into a corner those of us who believe that morality is subjective, and amongst that a large number of atheists. It's a curious perspective, I think. It seems to be based upon the idea that unless you take the statement, the Nazis are wrong, and assert that that is objective, that in some ways you are lacking. Curious because when I make that statement, it is a deeply held, heartfelt conviction that tells you a lot about what I believe. And yet somehow that is being portrayed as lesser than if I was simply just dispassionately relaying some moral fact about the universe, the equivalent of just telling you what the gravitational constant is, a fact about the universe that I might not care about, that I may personally in fact find distasteful. A curious perspective indeed. I think a lot of that is because people confuse and conflate what objectivity means, and in terms of morality, confuse it with a kind of deeply held conviction that you can't be swayed from, rather than simply relaying a moral fact about the universe, which is what it would be. Yet there is this fear, I think, about subjectivity, as if morals are subjective is the equivalent of saying that they are entirely unbounded and baseless, and that any moral claim is of equal worth to any other moral claim, and that the floodgates are open and that we can effectively say nothing about anything. But that is simply untrue. It is an unfounded concern. What is true is that we actually make hundreds of subjective statements every day, and we understand that those statements have value. We understand that those statements are grounded in something. And that is one of the two pillars that I think for our subjective statements to have some value. One is that it is grounded in something, and two, that there is an element of commonality. Imagine this. It is a cold day today. It's only 1 or 2 degrees above freezing point here in the UK, my part of the UK. And I walk out of my house and I'm walking down the road, and who should be coming the other way but SJ Thomason. So I hail her. I think her name is Stephanie. I've seen that on a couple of hangouts. So I hail her. Hi, Stephanie. Boy, it's a cold day today, isn't it? I doubt that her response would be, what are you talking about, Noel? This is just meaningless verbiage. This is just guff. This is just your subjective experience of the temperature, and it is no more rational for you to say that it's cold today than it is for you to say that it's warm today. I can glean nothing from your statement of any value. I don't think that she would say that. I think that she'd probably nod and go, boy, it is, isn't it? It's a pretty bitterly cold day. I then carry on down the road, and I meet my good friend Percy the polar bear coming the other way. And I make the same exclamation to Percy about what a cold day it is. But I get a very different reaction from Percy. Don't worry, he doesn't eat me. He's my friend. Percy looks at me gone out, as if, what are you talking about, Noel? Right? He says, cold today. Honestly, he says, this weather's a bit too warm for me. I'm actually uncomfy in my own fur in this kind of weather. I prefer it a fair bit colder than this. This is way too warm for me. So what is going on here? What is going on here is that I'm making a subjective claim, but that claim is grounded in something. It's not groundless. It's not just the same as any other claim that I could make about my experiential temperatures of the day, because it's grounded in my physiology. And there is commonality when I talk to Stephanie Thomason, but not when I talk to Percy the polar bear. Consequently, that claim has some traction when I talk to Stephanie, but not when I talk to the polar bear. And I propose this is the nature of our subjective claims when we talk about morality, and why they can be subjective claims and yet still have some basis. They're still grounded in something, in actual factors to do with ourselves, and as the same species, we're all human beings, there is that aspect of commonality. But looking at the questions of the Nazis, what I want to do is to fire the question back. How can SJ Thomason claim that the Nazi Holocaust is objectively wrong? Okay, I want to play you a clip of SJ Thomason talking to G-Man about a hangout that G-Man had on morality with Shannon Q. And then I'll have a few comments to make on that.
So what I'm really interested in, if you're willing to kind of take the talking stick, would be, what is God's standard of morality? So if you had to define God's morality, if you had to say, God's morality is this, and define it so that we have the metric, that we have the bar by which we're judging the conversation topic on, how would you define it?
Let me pause for a second there. I think using Jesus Christ, he sent Jesus Christ down so we could have the metric against which we can judge our own actions. We have a character, a person that we can actually look at his actions, look at how he treated others, look at the laws that he gave us, look at how bold he was and how courageous he was, and also how obedient he was. And so I think that we can just look at him as our standard. And so that's just my opinion. But G-Man, did you want to comment on this?
From a Christian perspective,
Yeah.
I would say that the standard is us. I'm sorry, not us. I'm sorry. The standard is God himself. It's his very nature. He is the standard.
Agreed.
Okay, so it's a bit of an aside from the point of this video, but I can't play that clip and let it pass. What a wonderful avoidance of a question that they didn't really want to answer. Initially by G-Man in the debate with Shannon Q, but then by Thomason reviewing it afterwards. She wanted some flesh on the bones, did Shannon Q. What is God's standard of objective morality? And instead they just give this ambiguous, wholly unrelated answer. Well, we gauge our morality by God's behaviour. Wonderful. That's really enlightening. That really answered the question, didn't it? No, it didn't. But that is a really, really important point that I want to dwell on here, is that both G-Man and Thomason were claiming, they were quite adamant that God should be our reference point, that God's actions should be our reference point for our morality. And that is something that I want to challenge within the rest of this video. Let's consider God's actions then, and consider this in the light of what we're talking about with regard to the Nazis, and of course most specifically to their greatest atrocity, which was the Holocaust, the actions that they carried out on the Jewish people. Okay, now I'm not going to bore you with some of the actions of God that you might assume that I'm going to go with, the global flood and Noah and all that kind of stuff. Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son, being willing to carrying it out, that being seen as moral objective good. Or Moses, was it a Midianite town that he sacked, and he sent his soldiers in then to kill all of the civilians, apart from the young virgins, which the soldiers could keep for themselves, that being portrayed in the Bible as a moral objective good. Forget about all of those things. I want you to consider the Deuteronomic history documents, which are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and the perspective of the Deuteronomic historian or Deuteronomic historian school of people that wrote those documents. And there is a very particular perspective there. That what happens is that the Israelites, the Jewish people as were, fail to keep Torah, fail to keep to the law of God, which they were instructed to do, and God punishes them. So there's a cycle of punishment and redemption going on. And that the actions, the things that the Israelites suffer, are portrayed in that light as punishments from God. And that includes things that happen via foreign powers. God is acting via foreign powers to persecute the Israelites. So it's not just me saying this. Let me play you a clip that's from Professor Christine Hayes, who's a professor of religious education at Yale University. This is part of a very highly recommended video series looking at the Tanakh, the books of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. Let me play you a clip.
It was a fundamental tenet of Israelite monotheism that God is at once the God of history, capable of all, whose will is absolute, whose promises are true, and at the same time a God of faithfulness who does not abandon his people. He's both good and powerful. So how could the disasters of 722 and 586 be reconciled with the conviction that God controlled history and that he had an eternal covenant with the patriarchs and with David? The historiosophy of the Deuteronomistic school is the response of one segment of the Israelite community. We'll see another response when we turn to the prophets. But the basic idea of the Deuteronomistic school is that God's unconditional and eternal covenants with the patriarchs and with David do not preclude the possibility of punishment or chastisement for sin as specified in the conditional Mosaic covenant. So you see how both ideas are going to be important to hold in dialectic tension, both theologies, the covenant theology as well as the patriarchal and royal theology. So this is because although God is omnipotent, humans do have free will, they can corrupt the divine plan. So in the Deuteronomistic history, The leaders of Israel are depicted as having the choice of accepting God's way or rejecting it. God tries to help them. He's constantly sending them prophets who yell at the kings and tell them what it is God wants of them, but they continue to make the wrong choice. They sin, and ultimately that brings about the fall first of Israel and then of Judah. And it's the idolatrous sins of the kings that does it.
So I hope you can see the issue here. According to the Deuteronomist, these acts that are carried out by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, these abhorrent acts, these acts that would class as atrocities from our modern perspective, are carried out by God acting through foreign powers. These are acts of God. Therefore, according to SJ Thomason, indeed G-Man, these are objective moral goods because these are God's actions. When King Zedekiah is made to watch his sons slaughtered in front of him before having his eyes gouged out, that is a foreign power acting out God's punishment for the sin of idolatry. Ergo, that is an objective moral good. So maybe you can see the issue here for SJ Thomason and her fellow apologists. We now have a third instance of this happening. There's the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and now we have another foreign power, albeit a foreign power within their own country. We have the Nazis carrying out another abhorrence, another atrocity on God's chosen people. What is to say that this is not yet again God acting through a foreign power to punish his chosen people for not keeping sufficiently to the law, for acts of idolatry? Indeed, if I can be a little bit cynical for the moment, there are only two really significant differences between this later atrocity than the two early atrocities that I can think of. The first is that the later atrocity is far more recent, and we tend to wince and back away from drawing the same somewhat shocking conclusions about things that happened recently when we're quite blithely prepared to do it for things that happened 2,500 years ago. That seems a lot less a lot less troublesome for us. And the second is that the Deuteronomist is no longer around anymore to draw those kinds of conclusions that then get written into the Bible and become God's word that the likes of SJ Thomason have signed up to. But given that, on what grounds then can SJ Thomason feel absolute certitude that this latter event could not possibly be God's punishment for the Jewish people acting through a foreign power? I don't see any grounds that she can assert that, and can assert as a Christian that it is objectively wrong if the basis for her morality is God's actions. And here lies the true horror of objective morality. You see, the assumption that moral objectivity is desirable is predicated on the further, somewhat unwarranted assumption that the moral facts will be to our tastes. The problem is our tastes would have no bearing on such facts. Indeed, Thomason has no business to view the Nazi atrocities and assert, well, God would never do that. If God does it, it is objectively moral, and that is that. Thomason's abhorrence counts for nothing here. Likewise, if God asserts that boiling babies alive in giant vats of battery acid is moral, then if morality is objective and based on God's nature, Thomason could say nothing. All she can do, the right thing for her to do, is to get her vat of battery acid stoked up to temperature and start looking for some babies to throw in. If morality is objective, then we just have to hope, we just have to cross our fingers that what is objectively moral does not appear terrible to us. We can only hope that what the Nazis did is morally wrong and not right. And if those hopes are dashed, if what the Nazis did was objectively right, it would be as futile to argue against it as it would to argue the speed of light is distastefully fast. So I'll take subjective morality any day. I can argue against Nazis and what they did, and my arguments can have merit. Thomason's don't. Nazis are either right or wrong, and our arguments and feelings are an irrelevance to that. I can argue with a deity's baby-boiling pronouncements. Thomason just has to accept them. Objective morality, when taken to its logical conclusion, is a truly frightening idea. At least it is if the basis is either a cold, uncaring universe or a deity beyond our real comprehension, rather than a label we hope to give extra weight to our own subjective moral claims, which is effectively how most people, including Christians who claim moral objectivity, actually use it. So I propose this is a bit of a hole for Thomason. Effectively, because she cannot be assured that what has happened is not God's actions through a foreign power, she cannot be assured that this is not an objective moral good that she cannot object to, even if she would like to. Let me try and dig her out of the hole. I think that it's based on a piece of fallacious reasoning. A piece of reasoning that is not only fallacious because it's proposing a God that doesn't actually exist, but is fallacious even if her proposed deity exists. Let me try and explain why. The proposal is effectively an unprecedented one, which is that God should be our reference standard. And I propose that it is unprecedented because it runs counter to every other example that we have. Let me try and explain why. So I like to eat bacon. I do. I really like a bit of bacon. Bacon sandwich, something like that. Gorgeous. And I kill pigs. Effectively, not personally, but vicariously, I kill pigs. I pay somebody to pay somebody else to pay somebody else to kill a pig, and then it ends up beautifully sliced and cured upon my plate. And I eat it. I eat that pig that has been killed, right? And personally, I don't see that as immoral. And so I think it's worth looking at in what ways do we view other agents. And I believe that there are two factors that are involved here. One is intellect, intelligence, intellect levels relative to us. And the second is a sort of speciesist factor. And if you don't understand where I'm going with that, imagine I go round to SJ Thomason's house and she's cooking me a nice bacon sandwich before we have a debate. And I've got my pet dog with me, and I've got my pet pig with me. I think she might be less reticent to chuck a slice of bacon down for the dog than she would for the pig. Not because the pig won't enjoy it, but because we feel some reticence with the idea of a pig eating the cooked remains of another pig. But imagine this, we have this discussion, Thomason and I, and we're joined by a third interlocutor, right? And this interlocutor is not a human interlocutor. It is a pig. It is a porcine of great intellect that is waxing lyrical in this discussion on the various merits and demerits of subjective and objective morality. Now imagine if that was the case. Imagine if pigs were as intelligent as humans are. I propose to you I would feel very different about eating pigs, about killing pigs, about how morally I interact with pigs. I propose that no longer would I be prepared to layer slices of bacon betwixt bread in the manner so famously proposed by John Montague, the 4th Earl of Sandwich. And so here's the rub with this. Pigs aren't like that. Pigs aren't on the same level as us. And because pigs are on a different intellectual level to us, we treat them differently as moral agents than we would if they were on the same level. Now, I can tell you there is a finite intellectual gap between me and a pig. Some people who have watched a bit of my material may doubt that, but I'm telling you there is a gap. I'm fairly convinced of it, but it is a finite gap. I can tell you that the intellectual gap between God and I is infinite. It's just a function of infinites, that if you have an infinite intellect compared to a finite intellect, the gap is always infinite. So the intellectual gap between God and I is substantially greater than between I and a pig. Now imagine that pigs were to try and decode a moral code for themselves. There may be some merit in looking at human morals. They'd have to be a bit careful with different species. Different things may apply. There may be some merit in them looking at human morals and how humans interact morally with other humans and the standards that they set, the codes that they set. But you can see clearly what a terrible misstep it would be for pigs to say, well, let's have a look at how humans treat pigs and use that as our moral code for how pigs should treat pigs. So on what basis can Stephanie Thomason then look at God, much bigger intellectual gap between God and me, and say, well, yeah, our reference point for how humans should behave with humans is how God behaves with humans. That is not a sensible thing to do. We would be making the same mistake as the pigs are making. Now, the God that Stephanie believes in is by design given purported characteristics such that it cannot have a peer. Would that it could. If it could have a peer, then we could see how God interacted with its peer or peers and maybe glean something from that. But honestly, it would be a terrible misstep to try and glean how God interacts with us and try and use that to calculate how we should interact with one another. So why do they think like this? Why do they make this argument? Why does it seem intuitive for so many Christians that, well, yes, obviously God as an infinite intellectual being would be the perfect example. How he treats us would be the perfect example for how we treat us. And I propose to you it boils down to what is a long-standing traditional Christian inability to grasp the ramifications of the incredible, infinite characteristics that they purport for their deity. They purport a deity that is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, somehow transcendent, and yet omnipresent at the same time. A deity that is a million miles beyond our ken, and yet at the same time they talk about him as if he's effectively your dad, but on steroids. He's just the big man. They portray him in more or less the same way that Marvel portrays the god Thor. If you don't believe me, let me play you a clip. SJ Thomason made a response to me. Most of the video response is not worth me responding to because it's almost as if like she's just talking over everything I've said, just ignoring it and just saying what she wants to say rather than actually responding to it. But let me play you this clip. I just outlined how these incredible characteristics of God effectively means that we can add nothing to God's life because he has these infinite characteristics, and what she says is, yeah, but he's our dad. Dads like having children. It's one of the most wonderfully naive answers, heartwarming in a way. Let me play you the clip and you'll see what I mean. She proposes a deity that is omniscient and omnipotent. We are effectively the playthings of a being that has no need for playthings, that has these infinite characteristics. There is literally, definitionally, nothing that we can do that in any way can add to that which already exists because you have an infinite superlative being to begin with.
Let's point out that this infinite superlative being also happens to be our Father. And so the idea is I don't have a need. I don't need to have children. I did not need to have my two sons. However, I wanted to have my two sons because I know that they would bring love into my life and I could give them love. Accordingly, in the same way, our Father has many children, billions of children. And one of the reasons is probably because he knows that we can bring him love and he can bring us love and he can teach us to love.
I'm sorry, I mean, it sounds rude, but there's just such a staggering naivety to that. I can only say it reminds me of my son. He's 4, going on nearly 5 now. And I like to talk to him about science, try and sow the seeds there, and discuss with him about space. And I try to get across to him the sheer enormity of space and the distances involved. And he nods his head, and I kind of feel like it's sinking in. But then he'll ask me a question like whether the stars are further away than his cousin Luca's house. And I realise that it's not just that he doesn't understand the concepts, but he doesn't understand that he doesn't understand the concepts. Okay, that's the end of the video. Where does it leave it? I propose for the SJ Thomasons of this world and her ilk. They are in a position where effectively they need to abandon this somewhat absurd idea that an infinite intellectual agent, infinitely more intellectual than us, that their interactions with us are a suitable yardstick for us to judge our own interactions with one another. That is entirely unprecedented. It makes absolutely no sense. All the other examples we have of that point in completely the opposite direction. Either abandon that or just have to suck it up that in the case of things such as the Nazi atrocities towards the Jews, that they are in fact the ones that can say nothing about it. Why can they say nothing about it? Because it could be that this is God's actions and then objectively morally true, and because outside of objective moral rightness or wrongness of those actions, their feelings, their opinions, their moral arguments count for absolutely nothing in either direction. Okay, hope you've got something out of this video. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment. Interested to know what you thought about it. If you're enjoying this material, let me know that as well. If you enjoy a lot of these videos, then consider supporting my work through Patreon, Subscribestar, or PayPal recurring payments. Blah de blah de blah. I'll leave the links down below. Thank you for watching, and bye.